British government has always been absolutely useless at doing any forward planning for the arrival of refugee, asylum seekers, or sudden arrivals of any kind. They're always reinventing the wheel. They do it first with the Hungarians in 1956. You see it in the late 60s with the arrival of different sort of Czech groups, and the Kenyan nations in 68 as well. So when you have the Ugandan Asians arriving in 72, it's all, rather than it being a test case, it's seen as being, we have to do this as the last cry of empire. They've been backed into a corner and have to take responsibility for a certain section of Ugandan Asians who've been expelled. We start having Vietnamese refugees coming after 1979, and although it's fewer than the Ugandan Asians, so it's about 20,000 people over 4+ years, so it's a different kind of intensity of operation. Again, the government's starting from scratch, and although they once again enforce a policy of dispersal, it's not because they're following a pattern from the Ugandan nations. They're sort of making it up all over again.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Expulsion at 50. My name is Dola Vasani. This podcast series has been created to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the expulsion of Asians from Uganda. Over the years, academics around the world have written about the expulsion from different angles and perspectives. In February 2021, I spoke to Becky Taylor, who has written much about Ugandan Asians, volunteers, and race relations in 1970s Britain. I hope you find it interesting and insightful. Maybe we can just start by you just telling me briefly what you do and at the University of East Anglia, and and then subsequently, of course, how did you get interested in this subject?
Yes, so I'm a historian, and as I say, I work at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And for a long time, my research has centred around the relationship between minority and marginal groups and their relationship with the British state and wider society. And a few years ago, I started a project that looked more generally at refugees coming to Britain across the 20th century. So I've just finished a book, in fact, that's on that topic. And in the course of doing that research, although obviously Ugandan Asians weren't technically refugees, certainly the way they were received by Britain cast them as refugees. And so they became one of my research areas. So I ended up spending quite a lot of time in the archives, National Archives in Kew, and at various provincial record offices, finding out how Ugandan Asians had been received and resettled right across the UK in that kind of key period of 1972-73.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, you started doing the research on the experience of refugees in the 20th century coming to Britain, and then you came across the Ugandan Asians, and I was just wondering whether you had known anything about them beforehand.
To be absolutely honest, I came from a position of basic, complete ignorance, which I think in some ways makes it interesting as a historian, because you're kind of, I was then looking at the sources that I had, I think, with a fairly open mind. I mean, obviously, as someone who lives in the UK, I was very aware, particularly of the well-established Ugandan Asian population in Leicester and their success as a group, but I knew nothing more than that. So when I went into the archives and I started finding this material, it was really interesting to see the events unfolding almost before my eyes as I sort of go through the documents in the file, and you see the so-called problems that their arrival is throwing up, and how in fact it sort of very much throws into sharp relief a lot of the problems that are being experienced within Britain and British society in this period. I didn't really know anything, so for me it was a very steep learning curve. And it's also interesting when you work just from the archives and then you're writing something and you're publishing things, and there are still people who are alive who've gone through these things and remembered it. There's always this question in your mind of, well, to what extent have I, because of my work through the archives, have I been able to capture something of the reality of the time, which tells us something about the craft of a historian, in fact, because that's what we're always doing, is working with these archives, whether it's looking at the 1970s and Ugandan Asians or 17th century Scots tax systems. I mean, how much of what we're able to recreate from the documents that are left behind is a big question within history. So it's really interesting for me to get a sense also, so people who've responded to work that I have out in public now, how people respond to my interpretation of events as we see it through that archival lens.
And how would you say that is? What is the sort of the general interpretation, would you say?
It's really interesting for me is the big disjuncture between the current sort of narrative around the Ugandan Asian community within the UK, which is all about success. It's about, we came in 1972, or they came in 1972. They were hardworking, they were businessmen. Look what amazing things they've done. Okay, so, and it's very much couched as a story of success. And, for very many individuals who've gone through that journey, then yes, they have been able to reestablish their lives in the UK and have, massively contributed to local economies and communities as a result. And there's no question of that. What I think is interesting, and what you see from the archives, is the great personal cost that must have had on the individuals, both in terms of that immediate trauma of flight and arrival, but also in the longer sense, because one of the things that really comes through is the absolutely appalling housing conditions that people were living in, whether it was because they were they'd been taken in by relatives and people were very overcrowded there, but very often if they are not with relatives, they're in very poor, basically slum accommodation where they're being exploited. There are a few people who managed to be given council housing or housing in new towns where things are better, but essentially we see the failures of the British housing system through the sudden arrival of the Ugandan Asians, and we see the racism. So, in the labour exchange offices and amongst the people who are meant to be helping them, we see these ingrained assumptions about the fact that these people can't do certain jobs, or, they're only deserving of certain jobs. We see people, who are very highly qualified being unable to, someone who's a research chemist ends up, manages after some years getting a job in an optician's, that's the kind of thing that would be replicated, hundreds and hundreds of times. And so hard graft, loneliness, racism, feelings of alienation, and, the appalling British weather. I mean, one of the things that's very obvious, it comes through so many times, is so a lot of the Ugandan Asians are turning up in October. And then their first months in the UK are over the winter, and it's clearly a horrendous experience for them to be in such a, not just cold, but cold and grey. I mean, today I've got, drizzle out there, it's 3 degrees. We're kind of, we know this is what February's like, but there's this, you just through the comments that you get of people, there's this sort of left in traces in the archives, just how shocking it is that people live in a country like this where the weather is so appalling and the food is so bad and tasteless and people are so unfriendly and they live inside and they never are out socializing and everything's so formal. So it's not just the British infrastructure, it's also the culture and the climate, which is obviously this massive shock for people.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. And I wondered also, and this is what has come through the interviews I've done, is the psychosocial aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Feel instinctively more than I find acres of material in the archives.
The level of shock and feelings of displacement experienced by the refugees often depended on where they found themselves in the United Kingdom.
I mean, I don't know how many of your interviewees have talked about this sort of the forced dispersal program that they had, and how Britain was divided into the red areas and the green areas. And the red areas, I mean, they were going to call them black areas, and then decided that maybe was a bit too racist. So the red areas were areas that were, quotes, already full of immigrants. So Leicester, for example, was a red area, Birmingham, Southall, other districts in London. Scotland, however, was the great green area. Scotland had been experiencing depopulation for quite a long time, and deindustrialization. There was lots of empty housing. You know, if you think that the weather in southern England or, you know, in the Midlands is shocking in the winter, if you go to Scotland, it's much colder, and obviously the daylight hours are much shorter. You have families who are, if they're relocated to Scotland, they're actually given quite a lot of support from the state. So they're given a council house. There are often, because the Scots actually within the UK have, I think, a reasonably deserved reputation for being quite welcoming to refugee and asylum groups even now. And so you have all these wonderful stories of you know, the town of Dingwall in the north of Scotland, sort of clubbing together to fit out the council house that's been provided for a Ugandan Asian family who are resettled there. And so, you know, when the family turn up, there's food in the cupboards, and there's, you know, a bunch of flowers on the table, and it's all welcoming. There's all these people there to help them. But it's like, you know, they are the only non-Scottish, let alone you know, Ugandan Asian family for about 100-mile radius. And what do you do for conversation, for sociability, if you want to have foods that are familiar, if you want to go to a temple or a mosque, or if you want to find somebody of, you know, who can marry your daughters? You don't want to live in the north of Scotland to do those things. You want to be somewhere that feels more familiar. So a lot of these families who are actually given a lot of state support in these, quotes, green areas, and not just in Scotland, but in areas around where I am here in East Anglia, for example. But these are all areas which aren't very attractive to migrants of any kind, because there's not much work and there isn't that wider sort of social network.
Yeah, and if I reflect on, you know, my own experience, you know, my mother in particular, she was 50 years old, and she was incredibly connected back in Kampala, you know, in the community, and was a very independent woman. And then we came and we were in a camp, resettlement camp in Yeovil in Somerset, and then ended up in Harlow, Newtown. And she hated it. We all hated it, but she vocalized it because she felt so disconnected.
The new towns in particular, I mean, empty, unfriendly, lacking community. You know, they were new places, but in a dead kind of way rather than in a vibrant, coming to life kind of way, is very often how people describe it. So although, you know, being moved there into one of those new town houses, you were in some of the best housing you could have expected in the UK at the time, but that doesn't translate. Even though from a physical sense, it's like, great, you've got this new house, but that doesn't translate into those important sort of emotional layers of feeling human in a place. I think how it comes across even in these civil service documents and things that you would think of as being quite dry, you get a sense of the loneliness and the dislocation that followed from what was supposedly resettlement and people were now happily settled in, is, you know, how the discourse went, but the reality, I think, was very different.
Becky, I know you have also written much about the contribution of volunteers, particularly the WRVS. And incidentally, we received support from them, as did many of the other interviewees.
What was that like? Just as a matter of interest.
Okay, so I was only 12, so my experience is from that perspective. But so we had people in the camp, of course, helping out. And then once we moved to Harlow, there was an interesting concept of the adopted family. So we were linked up to an elderly couple who were very lovely. They were very generous. They basically were given the sort of the mandate to look after us. So they would visit and they would, see what you needed materially and, help you navigate the system. I always remember Mr. and Mrs. Treble.
Did that work?
They were very kind, very, very available. And I remember when I turned 13, they gave me a kitten as a birthday present. And subsequently, when we moved to London, simply because my mother really struggled to stay in Harlow, we continued the friendship, and they would visit us, So they were just, I would say a middle class English family who were kind.
I mean, whenever I feel despairing about being British and our apparent inability as a nation to be open to outsiders, when you see the number of people who do willingly step forward to take on roles like that, and I think the importance of the kind of the human contact where it's one person meeting another person as people, that's where you start seeing actually that's where we can start making connections, and we don't see the difference, we start seeing how we can build something together. And I think that one of the great strengths that you see coming through the archives is the number of volunteers who, not just in the Ugandan Asian resettlement program, but say in the Vietnamese 10 years later, or in the Hungarians back in 1956, that there have always been, as much as there are people who are wanting to slam the door, there's also people who open the door and welcome people in. And I think for me as a historian, trying to make sense of both of those currents in British society is one of the things that's not just interesting, but I think important for us today as well. For anyone who has empathy and thinks, how would it be for me if I was put in that position? I would want someone to see me as a human being, and I think that's as much the volunteers who have an opportunity to develop their sense of humanity and empathy. It's not just about refugees being expected to fit into a place and give back, but it's, I think, the process of all of us working at being human beings alongside each other that's so important. And I think that we get glimpses of that in the volunteer involvement in the resettlement program.
As you know, Becky, this podcast seeks to shine the light on the 50-year anniversary of the expulsion. What are the main messages and lessons you would like to share from the work you've been doing?
The importance of having both empathy with vulnerable strangers, irrespective of their passport status, and accepting that we as human beings have got a duty to take in people who are vulnerable, because one day, if nothing else, that might be us. And certainly the historic lessons show us that for people who are taken in, the people who are best able to establish themselves and quickly are people who are given crucial support over the first 2 years. Housing, access to being able to work, language training for people who are not speaking, in the case of the UK, English fluently, but also the ability to make the lives for themselves in the way that they want to. So rather than an enforced policy of dispersal, going, actually what we need to do is to invest in housing and services in the cities where people initially at least want to go, because that's where there are the opportunities to build those networks of familiarity. And once you have, once people are feeling comfortable in a place, that's when people flourish. And it's when people flourish, that's when people are also able to do things like be creative, to be able to do things like go, oh, I can do things for the community, I can do this, that, and the other. And I think, being generous, you reap tenfold, whereas being closed-minded and miserly, you just lose at every stage.
If you would like to share your personal story for a future episode of Expulsion at 50, please get in touch. The email address is expulsion50@gmail.com or on Twitter @expulsion50. Till next time, take care and stay safe.